Hello and welcome to The Wire. My name is Tania Roy and you're watching Graffiti. Inflation is not a new phenomenon. Food prices go up every year. However, the recent surge in food prices is causing a significant financial strain for many in India. To discuss this, I have with me Mr. Deepanshu Mohan. Mr. Deepanshu Mohan is Professor of Economics and Director at the Center for New Economic Studies at O.P. Jindal Global University. Welcome to the show. So basically, I would start with asking what is a broad view, what is your view on the rising inflation in India?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me here. See, when we talk about inflation, we need to look at or how we define generally inflation as is a general rise in prices of goods and services that consumers are most often consuming in on a daily basis. By 2013, much of what the RBI or the central bank used to do was to take into consideration another measure or indice for calculating inflation, which was the wholesale price index. This changed to the consumer price index around 2013. This background context is important because it's after that much of the inflation targeting policy in India focused a lot on what consumers are actually doing. It was high time that it was done. But what's happened in the recent years is that a lot of RBI's effort on inflation targeting has not directly or indirectly, I would say, had an effect on what's happening in the underlying numbers. And I say that for two reasons. One, if you were to look at generally consumer price index numbers, despite whatever the central bank might do by raising interest rates or increasing cost of borrowing, um, much of that has not yielded into price related effects or reducing price, particularly around food inflation, in that short period of time. Now, this is interesting because in the Indian context, much of the inflation that is explained in the consumer price level scenario is explained by what you would consider as food and beverage based inflation. There is a weighted or what we consider as a basic importance given to other categories like fuel, transport and communication, vegetables, housing to a certain extent. But the bulk of the CPI performance is based on how food and beverages are performing. Now, in this case, we've seen in the last sort of year cereals, milk, and what you would consider as vegetables to be the major driver of CPI performance here. Now, this is important because much of this is connected with the agricultural sector's performance and also how, on average, how much monsoon India gets. Much of our price patterns in agriculture is directly proportional to the monsoon situation that we have. So, El Nino, for example, the monsoon pattern that comes as part of it, 11 of the 15 droughts that have happened since 1950 have happened when there is an El Nino, pattern in monsoon trends. What it reflects is that if we don't get enough rainfall, farmers are striving to be able to get hardly to a basic crop yield. Which brings us to a larger question. Do we look at the Indian farmer as an entrepreneur or a community service provider in a rationed market economy? And this is where much of the inflation concerns have to be looked upon by addressing policy interventions which cannot be solely fixed on the monetary policy end.
Okay.
And in the Indian scenario, as we can probably discuss this, that fiscal interventions, the actions of the government matter the most perhaps in being able to look at prices around cereals, milk, and much of these patterns. Milk, if you would see from the 1990s, there has been a huge change in the way milk prices in India came down, and that was a result of a number of interventions made by different states, localized, community-based, milk service providers, and that helped bring prices down. For cereals, we haven't seen that. There's almost every year you will find tomato prices, onions going up.
Yeah, exactly. So the cost of preparing a meal has risen by 65% over the last 5 years, but wages have not increased that much. Wages have increased by like 27 to 38% or something. Living costs are rising, as you mentioned. And so, considering all these, where should we hold the government accountable?
Yeah, so as I was saying, the inflation pattern in India is driven because of much of what's happening on the food spectrum. Fuel prices also play a role. And I mentioned that for two reasons, because 2020, 2021, 22, we did have patterns where global crude oil prices were falling. India was actually benefiting a lot more from the cheap Russian crude oil that we were importing. The benefits of those were not passed on the retail price, and we can come back to this on why this was done.
So this is one part of
one
it. The
factor.
fuel
Yes.
that government was not passing on the benefit to the consumers.
And there's evidence now that some of us have argued that the oil market companies and the government might have had some understanding that the benefits would not be transferred to the retail consumers for a period of time.
Okay.
Whatever the scenario might be, that has an indirect effect on transport and communication costing, and also food, which is why CPI levels in all of these 3 years, 2021, 2022, and now 2023, has been high. The 2023 reality is much more driven by what I'm telling you on the cereal side, and now a lot of that is connected to monsoon and much of those factors. Now, where is that the government has been able to come in or can come in? The interventions they've made so far has been introduce export bans,
Yes.
which is a policy measure of the 1960s. You can't be part of a globally integrated food supply chain in passing export bans on any good that or product that you would consider as to be, in certain ways, not enough in production for a particular quarter. What it does is it sends the wrong signals to the market. A wheat ban, for example, did not have any effect on the domestic market price of wheat. The rice export ban, however, also did not have much of an impact on the domestic price of rice. So there is, and I've argued this before, that much of the policy interventions have to be backed by empirical reasoning of what the data is communicating. And if a certain policy is not working, our effort should not be to sort of take the same measure again on the agri-trade policy side. Now, domestic supply side problems, because inflation in India is largely explained by supply side phenomena. It's not just demand which is driving prices up. A lot of what you consume in the urban areas is actually driving much of the prices up of farmers who are producing these crops in the rural areas.
Okay.
Rural CPI, for example, we don't have data on what rural consumers are consuming and how those prices are going up to the best extent that we have on the urban CPI level. So much of this has to do with understanding what are the distributive costs, or in other words, the supply chain of bringing, for example, a supply of rice, wheat for stockpiling requirements for the government's use or to the urban consumer demand's use. How much of that is being addressed from a government's perspective on the farmers' welfare needs, but not only on the consumers' welfare needs. Because much of what the government tends to do often is to slash or bring prices down, suddenly introduce these bans, which do not help the farmer in any way. Farmer, as I said, is an entrepreneur. He also has to think, or she also has to think about expanding profit margins. And a moderate inflation is not bad in a developing country. You do need wages to go up. The point that you mentioned about wages is where inflation acts as an invisible tax on the poor. When I say invisible tax on the poor, what that means is for those incomes are rising, would not feel the heat of sudden few rupees of milk going up in its price. But imagine someone who has not seen, that is 70 to 80% of our income base, has not seen a rise in income in the last 7 to 8 years.
Yes.
That creates a situation where my household expenses now are suddenly going up. I'm using formal and informal credit channels to be able to take care of household expenses for rent, for other needs, including medical expenses. And that would add over time, because of not higher rising income, to my debt level. And which is why you're seeing in India right now that household debt levels are increasing,
Yes.
which has a direct correlative mapping, I would imagine, with higher inflation and low incomes.
And household savings are also at a 50-year low or something, right? So I was going through this graphic, and I could see that inflation was very high between 2008 and 2012 as well. So what is different this time, and how should we analyze the situation? How should we compare it, or whether comparing it makes sense, you know?
So one of the things when we look at different time periods while comparing performance inflation, which I'm again saying that a lot of our thinking around inflation is positioned around what's happening in the urban consumer demand base, right?
Okay.
2008 to 12 was a period where a lot of the external factors like global fertilizer, fuel prices were going up, and that's largely imported into India in explaining that that overall CPI levels would also take a hit. The distributive issues that I was talking about have been there in India for a few decades now.
Okay.
The reason is because our mechanism of policy making in terms of addressing inflation has not been pro-farmer, it has been pro-consumer on the government side. And as a result, whenever prices have gone up, monetary policy tries to do what it can. But from a fiscal policy perspective, the government's plan is that we're going to stock up PDS requirements for taking care of the extreme poor, and while letting the middle income classes to operate out of what you would consider as seasonal variation to prices. So if fuel prices go up or tomato prices go up, onion prices go up, we expect that yes, there are a few months that this will happen and then this will phase off. If you look at the government's in the last few years response to the inflation problem, I remember a few policy thinkers and names in the government who were very clear saying that inflation was a temporary problem of an economy coming out of a pandemic and this will phase off. And a lot of us at the time had cautioned that, well, we don't really see this happening because much of inflation problem in India is explained by supply side issues, which are sort of not pandemic related. Those are very structural. And as a result of that, when you look at the current reality of how has inflation gone up, the two situations are different from the past. First, you have a lot of the consumption pattern now being shaped by a K-shaped economic recovery. Certain groups have made a lot more income, and my sense is we are not adequately capturing what is the consumption basket of this group. Because a basic concept in economics teaches us that if your per capita income is rising, you might not spend on food that much as compared to other things like apparel, clothing, investments on luxury goods and comfort goods. As a result, the average consumption basket for you would change to someone else whose basic needs are milk, sugar, cereal, and etc. etc. So those who have seen a drop in their level of wages, as we were discussing, would feel the most heat when it comes to price rise because incomes are not rising and that tax is affecting that. Now, between 2008 and 12, wages were not collapsing or stagnating the way they are now. On the other hand, there's another index which is important to mention, that wholesale price index, or how producers are responding to inflation, was not at its low point to the extent it is now. And this is important to explain because generally in India, if you look at the consumer price index data and the wholesale price index data, there's a divergence. But that divergence at its highest between 2019 and 24, this last 5-year period. I must say that 2014 to 19 on food inflation, we didn't see a sudden or sharp rise in CPI levels. And if you look at the data on, let's say, the Lok Sabha election before 2019 and now what you're seeing now, the inflation problem was not that big an electoral issue in 2019, precisely because food prices were well managed. We had good PDS stocks and a number of those things. But in 24, you see that this is the large election issue. State elections would see, I think, more of that being articulating as towards a national election. But we can discuss the political economy of inflation in another context.
No, sure. Actually, these are interesting points, and discussing inflation in context of political economy is very important, especially ahead of the 2024 Lok Sabha elections. I would also like to add that, and also put up a question, that former Deputy RBI Governor Viral Acharya had said that the industrial concentration of India's top 5 private players is leading to persistent core inflation. So there is another graphic by CMIE which shows that the absolute percentage of net profit has significantly risen over the years, although the pace of corporate profit growth was at the slowest pace in the January-March quarter of FY23, but the absolute numbers have risen. So, and I was going through the Hindu Business Line. The Hindu Business Line also analyzed this subject. It compared the situation with the West. It said that US's corporate profits to the gross domestic income has increased over the years. So, considering all these, what are your views on corporates driving inflation in India?
So when we look at any market, there is, in basic terms, 5 P's that we try to get a sense of: price, product, position, profitability, and protection. As I was talking about inflation on the side of food and the agricultural scenario, farmers have been seen as community, service providers in a rationed market economy, and for them, protection and to a certain extent position of where they're producing and the product has mattered more than in the policy making architecture than profitability. Otherwise, we would have seen that the government's promise on farmers' incomes doubling would have all been met if farmers' profit was important. On the contrary, if you look at the corporate sector, in a certain top, what we consider as 0.1% of the wealth earners, the explanation is completely different. Profitability there has been the driving force of the underlying market performance. What that means is the following. If you look at much of the performance on even fuel prices, this underlying market conditions tells us that in basic economics, what we use the word is an oligopoly, but what it means is there are few sellers in the market who can at any point of time collude to keep the prices higher up in order to generate profits that are mutually compatible for their needs. The government may or may not allow for that. There are anti collusion practices that may be allowed. But if the government works in collusion with these few sellers, then you do that at the expense of the consumer, and particularly the low income earners. What has happened is the pandemic narrative gave a lot of what you'd consider as corporate wealth earners, and this is not restricted just to India. You have this phenomenon in Europe, in the US, and Isabel Weber has spoken about this in context to explaining a theory on sellers' inflation, how sellers are colluding to keep prices up, and it's largely greed and profitability that is driving that. Now, I would not say anything that is different to what Viral Acharya has said, which is much of the inflation problem in case of fuel anchored inflation and many other products where the underlying market conditions are oligopolistic or there are few sellers in the market, you would find that to be the reality. That there is collusion that is going to happen whenever there is a profit margin ability to earn profits more in order to not be reflective of the current market demand or supply, but largely for ensuring that your margins of profit are not compromised. And that makes the underlying effect of inflation even worse. So US, for example, right now, where many of the markets are seeing fewer sellers dominating market share, are seeing much of those prices up of services and goods, which otherwise would, because of competitive reasons, would have been priced much lower. India too, for example, and we've argued this in context to 2020 to 2023, fuel price related inflation. On food, as I said, the scenario for that level of sellers inflation does not stand because the agricultural interests of the farmer have not been kept in the priority as compared to what it has been done for the corporate sector. So one of the things we have to look at is anywhere where there is evidence on products in terms of price collusion, there has to be embedded policies in place which can drive what we'd consider as, and Europe did that by introducing a windfall profit tax. And a windfall profit tax, and I've earlier mentioned in cases of certain budgets that we could have a wealth tax as a cess included, with certain companies which were earning profit margins beyond a certain level could be enabled to do more in terms of what they are able to pay, and those revenue can be utilized for the government's welfare and social development needs. But such are the times that we are living in, that governments are beneficiary to greater alliance with corporate networks. A lot of the funding on party systems is reliant on those. And as a result, when you have oligarchic, capitalism the way it is thriving in India, few sellers would profit at the expense of the poor. And I think that's a reality which we cannot see anywhere going away for at least for much of the near future that we're seeing.
But can this issue also be resolved with the help of job creation?
So employment and employment generation is, again, as we've talked about inflation, there are many things about employment creation that are very structural to the problems within India. We never saw in India structural transformation from people moving out of agriculture to manufacturing sector to services, which is the general trajectory of structural transformation that employment measures for. Much of our urban growth phenomena is a service sector led economy. The rural economy is still dependent much on the agriculture sector, so our growth engines have been very divergent. There were some efforts made time and again for the manufacturing sector to do well. The current government has tried very hard for the manufacturing sector, but the set of policy interventions it has done has not really worked to the extent, and PLI scheme is a good example. So employment generation helps in ensuring people have means of livelihood and a higher income to be able to phase off the effect of inflation when the going gets tough. If you look at the mean inflation levels from 2008, the year you mentioned, to 2023, the mean inflation levels have gone up drastically, which means that the purchasing power of the rupee has fallen. We are able to buy less now as compared to what we could buy with the rupee in 2008. Which means our incomes have to also proportionately rise, and this is connected to the employment story as well. And there you would find that only certain select sectors have seen a huge chunk of increase, which are dependent to sectors with exposure to trade in services abroad. In the domestic economy, however, whether it's agriculture or manufacturing, both of these sectors have largely struggled, barring few years, which have been good with respect to monsoon, and agricultural farm incomes have been more. I must say that states like Punjab and Haryana, which were the thick of the entire farm law protest divide, have been the saving grace when cereal inflations have ever gone up, because these are the two largest sort of rice and wheat producing states, in particularly the north. And as a result, whenever there are stockpiling problems, buffer stocking issues for the government, these two states come in to the help. So a lot needs to be done in terms of, as I mentioned, the 5 Ps: price, product, position, profitability, and protection. Farmers, I think, too reliant on protection because they don't get profitability to be sort of prioritized by the government. And you have the corporate sector, which really is much more apathetic to the farmers' need, because the only issue for the corporate sector is that profit margins that are secured from the past as a result of this asymmetric recovery and the K-shaped nature of India's growth performance, that is not compromised. And as a result, you would find that always one person would sort of perform at the expense of someone else.
Right.
So in India's context, you will say it's the corporate person as opposed to the farmer who has been,
paying the invisible tax. Yes. Okay. Thank you for all these interesting points. John Maynard Keynes had famously said, "In the long run, we all are dead." He emphasized on the belief that policymakers should focus on short-term economic stability and employment over aggressively fighting inflation. We are yet to see what the Indian government does to mitigate inflation's impact on the vulnerable groups. That's all for this episode. Thanks for watching.